the older people, the grandparents and the senior elders from the desert, who often spoke to me in language which I couldn't understand or was just starting to learn a little bit. I think it was sitting in their way of storytelling that influenced my poetry. I say that because I couldn't understand everything that was being spoken, that I learned to listen with my heart and my eyes. And I guess that pared away a lot of stuff. My early poems were known as quite minimal, and I really wanted to get to the core. I think another influence was because, I was in my mid-30s, so I was starting to gain a little bit of hindsight about my journey, and definitely being out in the desert for that 10 years with my family was one of the pinnacles in my life. It was also the time that the intervention came, later towards the end of that decade. And the intervention gave me purpose because I was living on community, and my family was coming and they were sharing their concerns and asking me to give them a voice because they'd seen me at certain places around Alice Springs sharing my poetry. I also want to share, because there's so much Aboriginal poetry, there's so much great Aboriginal poetry, and at the moment there is, a real surge of young writers who are really unafraid to say what they're feeling emotionally and politically. But two of the early ones were Udjuru Nunakal, formerly known as Kath Walker, and Jack Davis, although Jack Davis is really known for theatre. But there's a wonderful book called The Macquarie Pen Anthology of Aboriginal Literature, which was edited by Anita Heiss and Peter Minter. And looking through this, I found a poem that Jack Davis wrote for Udjuru, or as she was known in those days, Kath, and it's called To Kath. Fight on, sister, fight on. Stir them with your ire. Go forward, sister, right on. We need you by the fire. Your mind is no flat desert place, but like serrated spears, you must lead the talk for our race, and help dispel our fears. You were not born to walk on by or rest in sheltered bower, but to fight until the ink is dry, until the victory hour. I just love that. I think it's, I'm not sure, 1970, I believe it was written and published. And I like looking through those old poems because it hasn't changed for me. Their meaning of what they wanted to get out of their poetry, to be published for the first time and have a direction of what they believe those words were going to achieve within Australia for Aboriginal people. It's still the same. And when I was saying earlier, when I started learning that I had a purpose for poetry, it's the same as those esteemed poetry elders of mine, that we have to keep saying our truth, and we have to keep writing with the hope of a victory hour, that we will be heard. And as our poetry is being published in books and in journals and online, I know that Australian Aboriginal poetry is being taught overseas and read overseas and embraced overseas. especially in these current times where overseas politics and injustices are very mirrored as they sit in our country. Now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, I have to switch screens here. So another thing that I learnt really early was the power of description. And in language, in our original languages, description was very woven into our words. We had very descriptive words, whereas English is a little different. We have to add description to words. And my schooling's been a little basic. I grew up here on Nadgeri country, and at the end of year 11, I was expelled from Clare High School for standing up to racism. They said I was a distraction and was banned from returning to do year 12, which was quite horrific for me at that time. So a lot of my learning has come from life experience, and I'll weave a lot of that into my poetry. I had the amazing opportunity one time to go to Kolkata in India and do a translation poetry course at Jadavpur University in Kolkata. I really didn't have much of an idea what they were asking of me. I just sort of thought India would be a wonderful place to travel to. And I had 12 students and we were sitting around the table, and I had given them copies of my poetry written in English, and they were translating it into Bengali, the language from Bangladesh. And one student asked me, he said, "Ali, what's the name for grass?" And I said, "Oh, you know, grass is grass." And they said, "In our language, we have 53 words for grass." And in that moment, I learnt so much from that question. I learnt the power of original language, of Indigenous language, of our mother tongues, about how when the language has been robbed from us and we mostly speak English now, that we lost this beautiful description, song-like way of talking to each other, and that everything we said was so descriptive. And I had my hard drive of photos from the desert, and we spent maybe an hour just going through looking at photos of the desert until I could point at one picture and say, "That's the picture of the grass that I meant." And he said, "Oh, the grass that sits at that the sun shines on at 5:30 is the sun setting." And in their language, they had one word that said all that. So I learned in that moment how important description was. And I'll just share one of my poems that I thought held a bit description from my book, Inside My Mother. It's my latest collection. It was published in 2015. Oh, this is the cover for the Macquarie Pen Anthology of Aboriginal Literature. It starts with a letter written by Bennelong and is a fantastic resource. But getting back to this description, it's called A Handful of Weeds. A woman lays down on the grass, squints one eye against the sky, changing grass stalks to towers of gold. Her grandson lays beside her, telling stories of Malu and Julpul. He imitates their movements in that old sacred dance. A blue-tongued lizard lumbers past. Its tongue protrudes from prinkness, its mouth surreal and hissing. The boy is surreal in his love of her. The pattern of his feet is her pulse. His skin shines with his trust of her. At dusk, headlights force a crusade in the moment before discovery. he puts a handful of weeds on her grave. So using description is also how we paint a picture. I think as Aboriginal people, we're very visual. We have very good eyes. We have maybe a different way of seeing the world than non-Indigenous people. And it's really important to use words to paint a picture. So grass, it's not always green. It might be brown. It might be towering. It might be flowing. There's always words that we can add to help paint the picture that we want to show. My next note, sorry for the pause. I'm going to talk a little about the importance of words. You know, we use communication so much in our daily lives with our family and friends. And our words can be casual, they can be comforting, or they can be devastating. We can be really dangerous with our words. And that's okay. That's how we are as humans. The writing of poetry is how we let others know who we are, and our poems reveal how we feel. And just another poem that I wanted to share about how I was feeling one time down at the where the River Murray mouth is, and sitting with some elders down there listening to their stories, and I wrote this poem. Tribes gather on the sand at the ancient birthing place. A magic pelican child is born. A carry basket is woven from reeds. Baskets are heavy with story. Baskets are woven with story. Baskets are woven with song. My basket is heavy with history, out of sight like superstition. Our footsteps in the sand will turn to rock soon. My father is that sand dune. That rock is my mother. I think that was an important poem for me to write, because for most of my life I didn't think I had a voice. I didn't know where I belonged. I was very lucky. I had a good adopted family and remained close to them and still are. And we grew up on a farm out here, so I had land. I had, I rode for miles around these roads out here on my push bike with a, glass jar down the dams and the creeks, catching tadpoles and whatever. And so I reflect on those times about the light that I remember from the sky and that space and just being, and I take that memory and bring it to the current day about when I'm sitting down with elders and hearing the actual stories, creation stories of our land. For me, I try to write and include a lot of nature in my poetry, because we are part of this earth. We are part of nature, and without it, I feel really diminished. And even when I'm travelling overseas, meeting other Indigenous cultures, it's the same practice. They're like taking me to places that are significant and special and sharing their creation stories and what it means in the current day. I'm not sure of the time from that first block, but maybe we can pause if anyone has some questions that they might like to ask through Elijah.
Oh, well, thank you, Ali. That was beautiful, and I love that. The idea of being diminished without having that environment. And I was even going back to my childhood then and thinking about the creeks that I used to play in and some of the beauty of the world.
Yeah, I don't think you become a poet. I think in we've always been poets. I believe that of everyone, and as we reflect back, then we realise, oh my God, I was sort of like, there's a poem back there, but I didn't recognise it as a poem, but it can be a poem now.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember travelling up a little while back to Unangook lands and just being up there when they've had some rains, and you want to try and describe this landscape where these blotches of paint have almost come down from the heavens and just made this massive painting of all these different colours. But sometimes you do get lost for words. You do get lost for those descriptions. So I think that's something that I'm going to have to keep being mindful of, and just how do you paint this picture with words?
I think when we can't find the right words in nature, that's the time to be really silent and listen, because nature talks.
Now, we have had one question come through from Jessica. She wants to know if this is going to be recorded, and it will. So it will be available online for a limited time. Afterwards, if you wanted to go back over Ali's words or share it with somebody who didn't make it to the live stream.
And we actually had somebody write in to say that
yeah,
the university that you mentioned is from their city. So I'm not sure if we've got somebody joining us from India or not, but yeah, it's nice to think that with this technology we can, reach audiences that we haven't reached before.
Well, I'm very fond of Jadapa University, and I'm very strong with their ethics. They are strong young people who fight very much for the rights that all people deserve.
Ali, we had another question just come through. How does one find other poets? I write poetry, but find that simply posting that online on social media platforms is unsatisfying after a while.
Sure. Most capital cities and maybe regional centres will have a small poetry group. You can contact your council, or in Adelaide there's the South Australian Writers Centre, and I think there's little poetry groups, like Salisbury has a writers' festival every year. Adelaide Hills, there's some poetry groups down at Victor Harbour and Galway. So you just do some research and contact those places and ask them, and hopefully they will point you in the right direction.
We've had another one come through, quite a deep one. So, as a white person, how can we reflect Australian landscapes in our poetry with sensitivity? Is there a right and wrong way to express our connection with this land that nourishes and supports us as white colonisers? I grapple with a sense of imposter syndrome when writing about Australian landscapes.
It is a sensitive subject, but again, a poem is the way that you want to reveal, and also how you share your emotional presence. So I would suggest my best advice in this short time is to say that it would be remiss to write about the Australian landscape, especially in relation to Aboriginal people, without acknowledging that we are the custodians and the first peoples of this land. I think when people know that really deeply, and it's not a fast track thing, something that you have to really work at, because everything else that we're taught in Australia mostly eliminates that truth. And And just another thought popped in, and I trust my thoughts as they popped in. One of the best editing tools that you could use is if you read that poem to your grandmother, would she approve? I guess that's something that I do. I'm not sure how that works for non-Indigenous people, but I think it is also another tool for truth, and not getting too big for your boots, as probably my adopted grandmother would say, because poetry also needs to be humble. And it's okay to write your unease and the process of your education about being on country, or your confusion about your proper place. I think writing those difficult poems, and I've got boxes full of them that are unpublished, but they may be, because I keep going back and looking at them, because I too am learning. We're all learning. You don't go to school and finish learning. We should be learning at a regular pace. Life insists on that, really. And so I hope I've answered your question in some way.
No, that's great. Thank you. And yeah, these are hard things to deal with, and I guess, you know, we learn as we go along.
I think one of the things I like in poetry is that it's supposed to make you uncomfortable. You don't necessarily want to make the reader uncomfortable. It may be the only way to get your poem across. But definitely the process of poetry, it's not all happiness and joy. It's quite a personal process. I've, you know, had many moments of tears and anguish to write, you know, a 6-line poem.
All right. Well, thank you for your questions. We might start with the next block, and then we'll chime in again with any questions at the end of that. Okay, so in this block, I wanted to talk about choosing a subject and structure. The topic for today is reconciliation, and that I'm sure that has different meanings for each one of us. Some people believe in reconciliation, really advocate for it. Like I said, my mother was quite a figure. She was co-chair of National Sorry Day when I met her, which is accumulation of years and years and years of her work. I met Annie Evelyn Scott, bless her, rest in peace. She was another strong, amazing, beautiful, articulate woman. Some people don't believe in reconciliation. They think it's a crock of whatever. But it's something that we celebrate every year, and I hope every year we move closer to a better reconciliation. Sometimes it's frustrating, I think, for many stolen generation people to have an apology breakfast can be a reminder that the apology didn't achieve as much as we had hoped. So again, there's people on either side of that celebration and understanding. But reconciliation for me then becomes a very personal thing, and it's about how you feel. And it's okay to acknowledge that it might not make you feel very good all the time, and other times it can be quite uplifting. So identifying those feelings is important. Often in my early days of writing poetry, I used to get really large journals, like I still use them actually. These big art journals, and just scribble all over them. And sometimes I'd write in really big letters because I was angry, and
and I was frustrated. And then when I'd got out of that, I would go back and I would cross out all the unnecessary words, because in conversation there's no filter and there's no limit. We can, you know, talk as much as we like. But in poetry, it's very important. Every word needs to be considered. And so I would take out my what I deemed was unnecessary, and then just look at the words that were left, and work with them to write my poems. Titles are also really important, and I found titles really quite difficult. Often I would just choose the word that was most important to me on the page and make that the title. I like one-word titles. And then with structure, I had learnt poetry a long time ago at school, mostly primary school. I don't think we did much poetry at high school. And another thing that was really important for me, when I first met my mum, I became an art student at Towndy Aboriginal Community College down at Port Adelaide. So I was also quite a visual artist. So I stopped listening to that old voice from high school. I still hadn't forgiven high school for expelling me. I used to get my poems and type them in quite large font and print them out and cut the lines into strips, sometimes cut each individual word and have them on the floor or the table and rearrange them into a bit of an artwork. And after a while, I realised that sometimes in that visual, you're actually changing the words to a stronger meaning. I played with that for years because I did have that training in Alice Springs doing creative writing. But when I was writing poetry after that, I was out in the desert. No one else was claiming to be a poet. Like I said, my traditional family, I didn't know whether they were interested in poetry. I didn't know how to ask. And so I was quite secretive. And I had some friends in Alice Springs who I would go and share my work with, but around, very, very quietly. And so there's different ways that you can place the words on the page. There's one poem inside my mother. Most of these are quite normal looking poems. And then there's one here that goes all across the page. It's it's called Severance. It's the story, one of the stories about when children are taken away. And I wanted it to be all over the page because that was how I wanted to represent. That's what it does to people. You can't be linear and nicely boxed. And for me, just progress nicely. I wanted it to show the shattering that I'd experienced. I have some poems that I wanted to share too that I chose this morning that were important. Now, of course, there it is. This this is a book, Firefront. If you can get your hands on this, I really recommend it. There are so many poems from different poets in this. There's 5 essays. So every essayist was given 10 poems to consider for writing for the essays. So it's a great anthology, again, across the years, and many new up upcoming younger poets are also in this. But there's two here that, as we're talking about structure and description, I also bring that back to family and people. Udjuru, again, she was the first published poet, Aboriginal poet in Australia, and was very successful, a beautiful writer. She wrote a poem to her son. His name was Dennis Walker, and it's called Son of Mine. My son, your troubled eyes search mine, puzzled and hurt by colour line, your black skin soft as velvet shine. What can I tell you, son of mine? I could tell you of heartbreak, hatred blind. I could tell of crimes that shame mankind, of brutal wrongs and deeds malign, of rape and murder, son of mine. But I'll tell instead of brave and fine, when lives of black and white entwine, and men in brotherhood combine. This I would tell you, son of mine. The beauty of that poem is reflected in a poem by her granddaughter, Elizabeth, or great-granddaughter, who writes to her grandfather, who was Dennis Walker. Papa, your weary eyes meet mine, worn and tired of hatred blind, exhausted from fighting for so much time. What can I tell you, grandfather of mine? You endured crimes that shame mankind, survived brutal wrongs and deeds malign. So let's not speak of sorrow and repine. Let's talk of something else, grandfather of mine. Let's talk of triumphs along the line, of unwavering efforts that never resign, of how you empowered your people with your heart aligned, of the difference you made, grandfather of mine. Let's talk again of brave and fine, of how your struggles lessened mine, of how I walk and dance and shine because of you, grandfather of mine. This is one of the reasons why I love poetry, and here in Australia, from just one family, there's two beautiful poems that weave 4 generations together, honouring their efforts against the struggle that Aboriginal people continue to make each day. In my own collection, I've chosen 2 poems again for topic. And it's interesting, the more you read and research and then bring that back to your own work, I think there's a lot of unconscious stuff that works in poetry. Poetry has a power that is sometimes hard to define. But the title poem for this collection is called Inside My Mother. These were the poems I wrote after my birth mother passed away. My mother screams as I touch her hair, attempting to brush away the coarseness with my hands, to entwine twigs filled with full with leaves into her locks, a tiara of green to soften her face. And our tears dry now, my mother is frailing. She talks only to those who have gone before, no longer seeing my love, no longer needing. And the wailing bursts from our mouths as she sinks to the ground, her mother the earth, my mother the dying, throws sand in her face, tasting the grit in her mouth, and wailing louder, throws herself forward, pushing her breasts into the softness of the earth, her mother, and my mother, the dying, crawls down into that final embrace. Her conversation incoherent now, as if like a child she is practicing words for the lifetime to come. And the syllables loud and guttural spill over the sand, her mother, the earth. And I walk away leaving her there in that cradle, safely nestled in the roots of that tree, safe in our country, our solace, her grave. I just want to mention with that poem, the breaks that I made in that one, you know, like I said, I used to move the lines around and move the words around. Some of my poems, I make the breaks where I stop to breathe. And so you can split a sentence and just put it on the next line and continue. Some you might want to use a comma. Other times you might not want to. I don't use a lot of punctuation and I get a little criticised for that, but it's my poem and I don't care. So yeah, sometimes when you're reading it out loud, it's very important to read your poetry out loud. Where you stop for a breath is a potential line break. And in the course of thinking about Mum, and it was a very difficult grief because I only met her when I was 34. And so I was so grateful for the years that I had with her. But when she died, it's like the 34 years of missing was also very loud. And it took me a long time to do that. I wrote this poem called The Last Cuppa, about thinking what it would be like when I'm about to pass away. And she just knew that one day she would fall asleep under the blanket that she carried everywhere as a veil from the evils of the world. And she just knew that the blanket would be decorated with a lap rug that her son had tucked around her so he could hold her one last time. And she just knew that her daughter would just know when to come to dislodge the cup of tea grown cold from the stiffenings of her fingers and brush her hair. I think for me as an Aboriginal woman, it's very important to remember that I am simply a page, one page in a big book. We say that we're the oldest cultural continuum in the world. So it's a very, very large book and it hasn't been finished. The ending hasn't been written. So I think of myself as just one page or one paragraph, and I'm trying to make that the best paragraph that I can by the way that I have learned to live my life, from especially influenced from 10 years out in the desert with the old people. And so I think a lot about time with my grandmothers, both from my adopted and birth family. And I think about my grandchildren who, you know, what age will I get to see them grow to? And great-grandchildren, would I ever know them? And so in the scope of several pages on either side of me, that's where I centre my poetry. I used to love thinking about my grandmother, you know, like out in the desert we have the kinship system. And so I had several grandmothers who were well known to the family and were effective straight away in my education and my welcome back to family. I remember one time at the Jilpi Pumper Festival up in the APY lands, and one of the kinship nanas was teaching me how to make a jampi basket, and I was terrible. I started off terrible, and like the women were like, oh, she's not so good. But I really practiced hard, and then I was making a beautiful basket. So the ladies are very funny. They wanted to claim me as their new kinship granddaughter. I think I ended up with like 34 grandmothers at the end of that day. But I'd sit there at the campfires in the dark in the evening and listen to their beautiful, you know, laughter and conversation in language. And I was getting a little bit stronger. I still couldn't really understand too much. But they were just so generous in sharing stories. And then in a very short amount of time, they all passed away. And so there was so many questions that I never got to ask them. And I think about that page that was slowly turning in that big book that hasn't finished being written. And I used to think about, why didn't we talk about when they were young and falling in love, and, you know, like when they first saw that handsome guy, and what was it like for them back in those days when they were young mums, still walking around on foot, or, you know, maybe they had camels that they could travel around because work was so scarce. So if you lost one job, you might have to walk 200 miles to the next job and whatever. And those reflections made me think about emotion, that generation and, you know, their grandmothers and whatever, we all sort of share the same emotions. I watched their faces with the happy stories, and I sat beside them at sad times as they wailed. Sometimes I didn't even know the story, but I knew when something happy was happening and something sad was happening. And I know that too. Sometimes when I'm emotional, my friends and my brothers and sisters, they won't know specifically what's affecting me, but they know that emotion. So that's another thing to really be considerate about in our poetry. I think walking the same path, like here, even though it's COVID times, Kalunga's a small village. I think it's got a population of maybe 250 people. There's lots of farms around here. But the Broughton River runs through this place. And so I'm free, because there's no one out there, that I can go for walks with the dog along the river. And we like walking the same path. And I guess part of that is because the more you walk the same path, the more likely you are to notice changes. And so that bush yesterday didn't have that bird in it. Your eyes become used to something that's common. And that allows me to become more attuned, or I feel more attuned with nature, because it's becoming more familiar to me, that re-walking that same pathway. And the more familiar we are, the stronger we become in our voice, I think. It's the same in a sort of negative aspect. If we're always drinking alcohol, alcohol will become the louder voice. And so for poetic's sake, we always start our journey at the same place. And then sometimes we might meander in a different direction at the end. But for me, it's that practice of going back and repetition. The other repetition I would really recommend is reading. And it's amazing. Most of my library is found up of amazing poetry books that I've found in secondhand bookshops. Sometimes on the lower shelf, in the last place. And any Aboriginal books that I find by Aboriginal authors, I always buy them and bring them home, because there's always someone that walks through the door that I can hand them on. That's another exciting thing. Yes, go searching. Poetry will appear in the most unusual places. Maybe we'll pause for some questions again, if there's any.
Hey, Ali, it's just me for now. We have a question come through though. Where is the best place to purchase any of your books? I prefer to support local stores and or buy from a place where the highest proportion of my money goes to the artist.
I always say to support your local bookshops. Bookshops are doing it tough, so don't order online if you can prevent that. Some of us live in remote areas, so you know we're a bit limited. But if you've got a local bookshop in your near vicinity, go in there, give them the name of the author that you're chasing. They will have a list of the books and a description. And so then you can order the books in, and it, you know, is usually a short time. It might be a little bit longer at the moment due to COVID and the mail being quite slow.
And if you're not in a position to purchase books, as we'd all like to be, but you can always go to your library. And if we don't have something on the shelf, we're 9 times out of 10 happy to purchase it for you. So it's always worth asking.
Yeah, and I believe the libraries are opening again.
Yes, yeah, we're open in a little bit of a different way than usual, but yeah, you can still come in and browse and use the computers and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, that's the only question we had come through, Ali. So did you want to hop into section 3?
Sure. Now, where's my other notes? So outcomes, I wanted to talk about outcomes, which seems a little maybe top heavy talking about poetry, because I think in the early days, most poetry is very personal, and that's why I've shared a little bit about that intergenerational poems of Udjuru and her great granddaughter. I think we often, it's a healing process, cathartic process, they call it. And I must be honest, I never foresaw my work being published. So for, you know, those first years that I was writing, the first, you know, almost a decade that I was writing, I was just writing for myself and my family and sometimes my friends, because I knew my friends were big readers and appreciated literature. It definitely wasn't for a public arena. And I remind myself about the importance of writing for myself. If I'm not honouring my words for myself and the process for myself, I think I've lost something. So I'm very aware of that. So poetry is a really great tool for healing. And writing poetry is one way to justify what we have experienced and survived. I think even though our stories are similar, our reactions in what we have experienced and survived remain quite personal. The process of writing is honouring our personal version of events. Poetry assists as we transfer our feelings from our thoughts to the page, and the written words become visible, and we can feel a sense of healing through celebration or truth-telling. Now, this morning, as I was looking at poems to share, and quite some years ago, when I had my Aboriginal Writers retreat set up here, so this was published in 2011, and Lionel Fogarty, who's a very well-known activist poet from Queensland, he was a Mulunjali man. He was visiting me and living here at the time. He was my gardener, growing vegetables. And we got the opportunity to put an anthology together for the Southerly magazine. And I'm having a flick at this morning, and I must warn you, this is a tragic poem. I'm very aware that the events in America are causing a lot of emotion, but I still wanted to share this poem by Vicky Roach. She's a Yuin woman from on the East Coast. And I wanted to share this one because poetry can often prove a great archive. And when other people were saying, no, that didn't happen, this happened. So this is a harrowing poem of something that happened probably nearly 30 years ago. And we've just seen it repeated in America. Much respect to all the families that have been affected, families and friends who have been affected by Aboriginal deaths in custody. It's called Jap. Am I the only one who remembers Jap? Who knew her name was Jenny Woods? The only one who remembers how she died, 19, alone, her lithe and beautiful body broken, bleeding on the concrete floor of a lonely convict cell, her bold, defiant laughter snatched with the snapping crack of a police-issue boot on the back of her neck. I wonder if the cop remembers the feel of her young body, crushed, despoiled, lifeless, beneath his heel. Has he slept well these past 30 years with his conscience and his memory of a dark-skinned girl with a long, proud neck and glowing dark eyes? Does he remember Jap? I do. You know, on Facebook at the moment, there's so much outcry about the importance for Aboriginal deaths in custody on this country to be acknowledged with the power of memory and the plea for justice, as America's calling out on you know, this recent murder. Well, there in that journal is an archive, a very emotional and harrowing, disturbing archive. This beautiful poem of this woman poet seeing her friend killed in a cell. It's the truth of Aboriginal deaths in custody that can't be denied when you read that poem. And this is another power of the poetry, you know, when it's published in whatever form, in a journal, in your own book, or even in the book that you keep and, you know, like you might just share with your family. I know there's lots of families out in the remote areas with handwritten journals that they keep in the house. And that's, you know, their family archive, poems of birthdays and other events are all recorded and just kept in, you know, preciously for that one family. I think the other important thing that I wanted to share, which is quite the opposite. Everything is a bit yin and yang. I don't know how to say that in an Aboriginal way. But, you know, we have good, we have bad, we have sad, we have funny. And it's really important to honour all those emotions and all those moods, because, again, all that combination makes up who we are as humans. There's a great poem by Lionel's son, Cargoon Fogarty, in a book called Yerrabilla Jimbalum, which I believe is part of their Malanjali language. But I remember this poem being really quite popular when we were doing workshops around Australia, youth Indigenous poetry workshops. Excuse me. And it's called Fair-Skinned Abo. I may not be charcoal coloured, but I'm black. I mightn't have sure coloured like a cloudy night sky, but I'm black. I may wear European clothing, but I'm black. I may own many white materials, but I'm black. I may speak English, but I'm black. I may not have the darkest complexion, but I'm black. I'm not an alcoholic, but I'm black. I'm not a drug-addicted dole bludger, but I'm black. My palms are white as the moon, but I'm black. I don't spear kangaroos all day, but I'm black. I may not live in the bush naked, but I'm black. I mightn't chase emus, but I'm black. You may think I'm a half-caste, but I'm black. That's right, black. Black to the bone, black through and through. My physicality may not be, but mentally I'm black. Dedicated to all not so black people. I think only a younger person could have written that. And the teenagers that we were working with, they loved it. We could hear them out on the basketball court, everything they did, they said, yeah, but I'm black, I'm black, I'm black. Had a real ripple effect. There's another beautiful poem. Now, what was that written in? It might be in this one. So this is written by a grandmother, Sue Stanton. She's a Gurindji woman. It's in a similar tone. It's another beautiful, more fun poem. It's called I Love Cheeky Coloured Boys. I love cheeky coloured boys, you know the kind, loving, playful, tricking all the time, big smiles, cheeky grins, that KI walk, that special talk, smooth negotiator, big time agitator, sometimes peacemaker, always heartbreaker. I love cheeky coloured boys, you know the kind, lover, brother, other, big boys, smaller boys, mama boys, sly dogs, slick operators, cute ones, hard heads, sporty types, smart lads. I love cheeky coloured boys, you know the kind, cuz, bruz, mulligers, any kind, strumming their guitars, thinking they're stars, they're cute, they're beaut, they're so full of loving, feeling, they'll have you reeling. Sometimes they're scamming, sometimes they're gammon. They're dreamers, they're schemers, they're darlings, they're deadly. I love cheeky coloured boys, you know the kind. I think it's really important. I wanted to share those because often with Aboriginal poetry, you know, we do write for justice and we write from a sense of sadness. We know many of us are still struggling for a sense of equality and hardship. And yet we have a wonderful sense of humour and we shouldn't diminish that in our plight for justice. I think I really love those two poems because they give you a pause to laugh and to strengthen and be strong and be more convicted in writing the harder poems. Kevin Gilbert was another senior poet. His poetry sort of came from within the Tent Embassy when the Tent Embassy was founded in Canberra, I think like 45 years ago. And he wrote some wonderful poems. And he did quite a few anthologies. You know, he was very good at promoting Aboriginal poetry at the time. He sort of was around the same age, or he was a bit older than Lionel. But yeah, he really left a big mark on Australian poetry, as did his daughter, who's just passed away, the really dear Anna Carey Reid Gilbert, who followed in her father's footsteps and, you know, really wrote a lot of beautiful poetry for the strength of Aboriginal women to be recognised and maintained. In my last conversation with Annie, she told me that her favourite poem by her father was called Tree. Tree by Kevin Gilbert. I am the tree, the lean, hard, hungry land, the crow and eagle, sun and moon and sea. I am the sacred clay which forms the base, the grasses, vines and man. I am all things created. I am you and you are nothing, but through me, the tree, you are, and nothing comes to me except through that one living gateway to be free. And you are nothing yet, for all creation, earth and God and man is nothing until they fuse and become a total sum of something, together fused consciousness of all and every sacred part, aware, alive in true affinity. So poems can be wonderful statements, manifestos to ourselves and to our families and community and to the world. And I think I have learnt to, in the blessings of my journey, to know that Aboriginal poetry is not just limited to Australia. We are people of the world, and the old histories from beyond colonisation are coming. There was many countries that visited here before the British who did not bring war. There was friendships, there was marriage, there was trade. There was the sharing of poetry and song. And I really believe that Aboriginal poetry is really starting to resound across the world. So it's just something to remember when you're, you know, like in the privacy of your own writing space, just to know that there's a really big purpose for our poetry. And, you know, there's a way of believing that and honouring that without, you know, getting egotistical. It's very important. What I've been shown to remain really humble in the power of our poetry. Is there some more questions? We're getting down to the last 10 minutes or so.
Wow. No, that's incredibly moving. We have had a couple of questions come through, and there's even been a request for a particular poem. I'm just going to try and double check what it is. Wild Flowers, which is somebody's personal favourite. But we've had two questions come in, and I think one of your poems really highlighted some of the issues that the questionnaire has raised here. She goes on to say, I am an Aboriginal woman who is fair-skinned. And because a lot of our language and practices are trying to be revived, I often feel torn between two worlds at times and often become silent instead. I guess my question is about how do you find strength to tell your story, write poetry, when it might not even be understood?
You know, I still get rather emotional when I answer these sort of questions, because if I didn't, I don't think I would have been here. I felt I'd got to a point in my life where I had little choice. But I was really blessed because at the time was when I made it back to the desert and had the blessing of 10 years with my traditional family. I have never been surrounded by more love as our traditional people know and give. and maybe, you know, that was amplified in the desert. But that time and all of a sudden, then I didn't care about all this other shit. I felt so alive and welcomed, and was starting to know who I was born to be, that it was like all these other doubts and things that had sort of kept me small. All these other things, you know, like it's oh, you weren't really stolen, and you know, you're better off growing up without your mum. I knew all that was, you know, absolute rot, and so I felt like I was a flower beginning to bloom, and I'm a bit stubborn too, so I just kept writing and writing and writing. Like I said, I could never have foreseen the future. But I know that it was making me feel something that I hadn't felt before. I was really starting to like myself, because I knew that so much of what I'd been told was untrue, and I needed to write against those untruths and say, you've sort of lied to me for 35 years, and you can't lie to me anymore. I think, you know, we have to be, like I said, I was in my 30s. So I think the process might be different when you're a teenager, but I think there's a similarity that you have to really have your eyes and heart open to know when you're given those moments. That's the moment to blossom a little bit. Lots of seeds are planted along the way. I think we know sort of when we get to the garden. You know, it's almost like sometimes that is replicated. You know, like I said, all those old people have gone now. But even in the city or somewhere, when I catch up with an auntie of a family that's not mine, who remembered me when I was all, you know, drunk and silly and, you know, lost, who goes, gee, you're looking good, and she'll reach over and hold my hand. Immediately I am back in the desert, in that essence of love of family and community. So I really look for those. My heart knows those moments as soon as I feel them. And usually after that, I will wipe my diary clean, because I know that there's a good chance a beautiful poem is coming, because I need to honour what that feeling, that handhold made me feel like, and I just know that truth will bubble up.
Wow. There really is this healing power to, wow, it's interesting when you talk about it and you start to feel it. And even in other art forms, in film, for example, when you see it unfold in front of your eyes, you realise, wow, this is really, really powerful stuff. And I guess sometimes we want to block ourselves from going a bit too far or going that next mile. And yeah,
and I guess for me, I've always felt like I was a second-class citizen in Australia. Definitely being expelled from high school for something that I didn't create, something that I stood up against because it was wrong. You know, but out in the desert, it's just so clear. The song lines and the singing and traditional dancing and whatever, they're all poems. And we're this longest continuum in the world. So we're carrying on a lineage of poetry that's been unbroken since creation. And it took me years to sort of get my thought around that, because it's a huge thought. But that's the truth.
wow. And our last question, if nobody else wants to chime in as well, Eve, do you want to read the last question?
Sure. So this is from Anonymous. How do you know when a poem you write is good, or something that you'd like to share with others? Is it a gut feeling? Do you make a distinction between writing that is just catharsis or potential publication?
Yeah, I guess, practice is a really good thing. So the more we're reading poetry is really important. Even if it's only teaching you, I don't like that sort of style of poetry. That's good. Don't read it anymore because you're narrowing the field. We want to get to our own voice sort of thing. And so reading's really important. So is writing. It's okay to write 2 months of not so good poetry to get one beautiful, strong poem. In Japan, the haiku masters, and haikus are very short poems, 5 lines, so many syllables per line. The old masters, they say you only get one good poem in a lifetime. And other people, when I'm overseas, other poetry professors, and, they hear people saying, oh, I'm writing, like a poem a day, and they laugh and they say it's impossible to write more than one good poem a year. So, it's a lot of the practice, and practice will give you that light. But it's also what I was saying earlier, that if you pretend that you're reading it to your grandmother and your grandmother gave you a beautiful smile because she was really happy with what you'd written, I think that's a really good, measurement as well.
Beautiful. Well, I wondered, did you manage to find wild flowers at all that you could perhaps indulge us with?
Yes, hang on. Oh, hang on. Oh, you're lucky. You're lucky. Here we go, wildflowers. Sit down. Wildflowers. Mallets pound fence posts, in tune with the rifles to mask massacre sites. Cattle will graze, sheep's hooves will scatter children's bones. Wildflowers will not grow where the bone powder lies.
Wow. Well, thanks again. Wow, what a truly moving event. Wow. Should do this more often. Wow. A big thank you, Ali, and a big thank you for those that joined us as well. And thank you for your questions. We will have some feedback forms as well, so we can try and make these things bigger and better as we go along. And yeah, we'd like to wish everybody, the best for their poetry writing, and I think I'll have a bit of a hack later on as well and put some words together and see what happens. So.
Yes, I had one line for if anyone wanted to write a poem. It's a line, you can use it as a title, a first line, a last line, or any line in between. And it says, and she forgives like autumn. I don't know, that line came to me this morning. I listened to all those strange thoughts that popped past. And anyway, I wanted to offer that. I want to say thank you for everyone who shared this time. It's been a real privilege. This is my first online. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the opportunity, Elijah.
No, you're very welcome. Very welcome. Thanks for opening our hearts and our minds. Yeah, thanks once again. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.